Hello, everyone. This is going to be 3.3. The Colonists Declare Independence. So, we're going to start with a quote from Thomas Paine, one of the great rabble rousers, one of the great propagandists for the American Revolution, who said, "In the early ages of the world, according to the scripture chronology, there were no kings. The consequence of which is there were no wars. It is the pride of kings which throws mankind into confusion." Not a fan of kings, Thomas Paine. Our objectives: we are going to explain why fighting broke out to begin the American Revolution and the response of the Second Continental Congress. We are going to describe loyalists and patriots, analyze the impact of Thomas Paine's book, Common Sense, more of a pamphlet than a book, and we're going to assess why Congress declared independence and the ideas that were underneath all of this. So let's start with the first shots being fired in the American Revolution. After the coercive acts, people like John Hancock and Samuel Adams set up a Massachusetts Congress, which was in against direct orders from England, and also in direct defiance of the new governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Gage, appointed by the king. The Americans also started to stockpile guns and ammo, which was very dangerous sounding to the English. On April 19th, 1775, Thomas Gage sent British troops out to collect these guns and this ammunition that was being stockpiled. It was mainly out in the boonies, out in the smaller cities surrounding Boston. And they also were going out to arrest American patriot leaders in places like Lexington, Massachusetts. When word of this got out, riders, led most famously by a Boston radical named Paul Revere, rode out into the countryside to warn the local militia, volunteer soldiers, that the regulars, the British regulars, were coming out to arrest people. So this is Paul Revere, 1734 to 1818. From Boston, he was a silversmith, a son of liberty. He was a propagandist as well. He created that Boston Massacre etching that we saw in 3.2. He was not the only midnight rider, though. However, he is the most famous partially because Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a poem about him called The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. So he's the one that we know best, partially because he had a poem named in his honor. "In hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere." That's just the ending of Paul Revere's ride. There was also a 16-year-old female midnight rider named Sybil Luddington, who once was quoted as saying, "I can ride as well as any man." So, eventually, about 70 American militiamen gathered in Lexington, Massachusetts to stop the British. They were met by several hundred British redcoats. So the militia got the order to disperse, and they looked at their army versus the bigger army and said, "Yeah, we can't fight this," so they started to disperse. However, as they were leaving, somebody on one side or another, we don't know who, fired a single shot that is known as the shot heard round the world. It turned into sporadic gunfire, both sides firing at each other, and this is the shot that started the American Revolution. And we don't know who fired that shot. So the British left Lexington, went to Concord, Massachusetts, right down the road. And when they got there, they realized that word had gotten out and that most of the guns and ammunition had already been moved out. So they had no other option but to head back to Boston. Now, the problem is word of the fighting had gotten out too. And so on their way back to Boston, the British were attacked by not 70, but by hundreds of these militia Minutemen, American militia who could be ready at a moment's notice. And they didn't just march up and attack the British. Instead, they waited until the British were at a corner. They would, fire from behind rocks and trees and shoot the British and then run away. And this was enormously effective. So here's a map of the long route from Boston to Concord and then back. It was a long way to go for the British. They had a very rough time doing this in April of 1775. Now, by the time British made it back to Boston, over 200 had been either killed or wounded. And Boston was very quickly surrounded by thousands of American militia. The Loyalists, the people who are loyal to the British, sometimes also known as Tories, immediately ran into Boston City to be protected by the British troops. With all this going on, we needed to call people together again to figure out what to do. So in May of 1775, delegates from all the colonies met in the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Again, their job was not to break away from England, not necessarily, not at first. Their job was to figure out what do we do with the mounting hostilities. This Congress eventually took over the responsibility for the American Army, which was in its birth at the moment, sending troops from all the colonies to go help Boston, organizing large-scale troops. They chose George Washington, delegate from Virginia and one of the few people with any military experience, to go and lead this Continental Army. And he had the experience. He was a trusted leader, even after he had the rough time of it in the French and Indian War. He was kind of natural at leadership. He had the look of a leader, too. And he was from Virginia, which was the biggest, most populous colony, and therefore they thought it should have a Virginian at the front. So here's George Washington volunteering for service, wearing his old coat of a soldier. And yeah, he towered above most other people in there, which also made him very promotable to this point. Now, Congress was split. We weren't necessarily going to break away from England. We were having fights with England, but it was, do we want to stay with England or do we want to go? Eventually, the delegates in the Second Continental Congress sent what was called the Olive Branch Petition to England, saying, look, we're sorry for what we did. We are your loyal and devoted servants. We want to make peace with you. Take us back. King George, however, ignored this petition and openly declared the colonies in rebellion and started to send more troops in to put down what he saw as an illegal rebellion. So here's King George III, who said once, "A traitor is everyone who does not agree with me." Now, let's look at how colonists disagree over the British rule, the Patriots and the Loyalists. So, the colonial population was split pretty evenly between people who were on the American side, people on the British side, and people who wanted to stay out of this fight. Loyalists were, why would you be loyalist? Well, a couple reasons. You might have a job with England. You may not like the idea of, violence and brutality that comes along with this revolution. Some people thought that they weren't getting a better deal. They were just trading in a bunch of sort of tyrants over here in America to replace the one tyrant that was really far away in England. So some thought it was a bum deal a little bit. Many loyalists were actually unhappy with British taxation, but they basically said, look, we don't do this. We don't fight these kind of wars. And they also feared the mob more than they feared the British. Some also said that America would probably not win this war. They thought it was ridiculous that we could fight a war with one of the best trained militaries in the world, and they thought that we should stay with England for that, too. Now, generally, most loyalists were also upper class, but there were also a few middle and lower class loyalists, depending on where you were in the country. Some stayed loyal due to the fact that they didn't like the Patriot people. This is especially in the Deep South, where poor immigrants living out in the boonies did not like the upper crust Patriots, and this led to a lot of bad blood and actually a lot of pretty graphic, horrible violence during the Revolution. Now, Native Americans and African American enslaved people mostly supported the British for pretty obvious reasons. Natives were in a constant struggle trying to keep the colonists off their land, and enslaved people were promised their freedom by the British if they fought. So here we see that there are different areas that are more patriot, certain areas that are more loyalist, certain areas that are contested, and then also the huge either loyalist or neutral area of Native America out there in the West. Now, this is a former slave and member of what was called Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. These are ex-enslaved people who fought for the British as a way to earn their freedom, basically. Now, let's look at the decision to declare independence. So, one of the ways that we convinced people that this was the thing we needed to do was in early 1776, a man named Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, which was published And it was, for its time, very easy to understand. It was basic ideas. It was Thomas Paine was aiming for the regular guy, not like the higher up fancy pants, but the regular guy sitting in a bar listening to somebody else read this thing. He was trying to get them to agree to this too. So Thomas Paine's book did help to stir up support for the American Revolution in a big way. So here's Thomas Paine, 1737 to 1809, born in England, where he was a writer, a propagandist, and an activist. Some historians believe, with very little evidence, that he helped to write the Declaration. Most scholars actually think that it was probably Thomas Jefferson. He also played a big part in the French Revolution, where he was nearly executed at the end of it, but he went on to survive. So he played a big part in both the American and French revolutions. He once said, "The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind." Now, Thomas Paine called for independence from Great Britain. He also said that we should form our own country made up of the United Colonies. He wanted to create a republic. So, a republic is a government where common people have the power to elect their own leaders, where the people have a voice. Now, back then, we're not talking all people, but definitely more people than in a situation where you have a king. He also didn't like the idea of a king, obviously. He was not a huge fan of the wealthy either. He believed that they were just feeding off of the poor, so he wanted to start something where the people had more power. Slowly, over time, especially after the king declared us an open rebellion, Congress started to shift away from reconciliation and, mending fences, and instead started to move towards independence. In June of 1776, a man named Richard Henry Lee of Virginia said he proposed a separation from Great Britain, and in order to discuss this and also to sort of clarify what their goals were and why they were doing this, 5 Continental Congressmen worked together to create a document explaining our reasons for breaking away from Great Britain, known as the Declaration of Independence. This is not a set of laws. It is a set of reasons for why we are leaving England, why we are leaving the king. On July 2nd, Congress voted that America was independent and free of Great Britain. Eventually, the official copy was dated July 4th. So one of my favorite lines is in his diary, John Adams said, "The second day of July 1776 will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other from this time forward forevermore." So that's why we celebrate Independence Day on July 2nd. No, wait. So, the main author of the Declaration was Thomas Jefferson, a 33-year-old Virginian. And he borrowed a lot of ideas from Paine and from Locke and other Enlightenment writers, giving basically a long list of why America should break away from England. However, most people don't remember the part where he says why we're breaking away. Most people remember his opening couple paragraphs, where he talks about the reason that we're leaving, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one country, so on and so forth. He called for a defense of natural rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and said that they were untakeawayable. They could not be taken away by any government. And since the king was trying to take away those rights, we had the right to get away from the king. Now, like I said, this is not a set of laws. However, a lot of the ideas from the declarations sort of come to identify a lot of the ideas of what Americans are looking for in a new government, one where they have these natural rights and the rights of people are protected from a tyrannical government. So here's the signing of the Declaration of Independence as painted by John Trumbull. The interesting thing is not all these guys are, excuse me, I'm hiccuping a little bit, were not all in the same room at the same time. They were, in fact, brought in at different times over the years. However, this is all 55 of them, or 56, and it hangs in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. Now, the signers of the Declaration did have different ideas about what all men meant, for instance, and that's why later on women's groups and African American rights groups are also going to say, what do you mean by all men? Now, their writing did, however, inspire future generations to work for the equality of all men and all women. Now, the signing of the Declaration was easy. Now we actually have to do the breaking away. And we'll look at that next. After I'm done hiccuping, apparently. Gosh.